This story was submitted by Tim. This happened to me on March 13th of 2013. At the time I was living in San Francisco where I was born and raised. I come from a good family. We were lower middle class, but nonetheless both of my parents were loving and supportive. They both worked full-time, with my dad holding down 2 jobs, leaving me and my older brother largely unsupervised. This led to us hanging out with the wrong crowd, and eventually getting into some illegal activity from a pretty early age. There's a massive subculture in San Francisco for graffiti, and through various affiliations my brother had with some of the more reputable graffiti crews, he got really into graffiti. It was common knowledge that these were fairly dangerous people, so when I started selling drugs, I felt I had somewhat of a security blanket. Messing with me means you're messing with my brother, and by proxy, his people. So between my family ties, and San Francisco being such a small city geographically, I felt pretty secure that I wouldn't be ripped off or robbed, as retaliation seemingly always served as a deterrent. My career began small, until I worked my way up to selling pounds of weed, as well as some pharmaceuticals on the side. Only in bulk, however. I would never just sell a few pills at a time. I had made a lot of connections and had a myriad of clients. Some I knew personally, and some were friends of friends. I had met a girl who had bought off of me a few times over the course of a year or so. I knew she worked at a bank and drove a nice car, so I assumed she had money. After a few months I met her boyfriend, Joey. He seemed like a douche. Harmless, just annoying. He was maybe 5'6", while I'm a fairly built 6'2". After a while, he started calling me instead of her, and he began buying larger and larger amounts, a few $1,000s worth at a time, so when he called me on the morning of March 13th and requested a larger amount than normal, I thought nothing of it. I left my house and walked a few blocks to the main street to meet him, as I never met anyone at my house, as I always thought it was best to keep my home's location a secret. The separation of my business and personal life was of importance to me. I always carried a combat knife with me at the very least, and that day was no different. When I met up with Joey, he was with 2 other guys. He wasn't always alone, and whenever I went to re-up, buy my supply, I never went alone for security reasons, so I assumed Joey was doing the same. I got in the back seat of the car, and we drove a few blocks to a side street. Joey was driving. A guy around my size sat to my left, and another guy around Joey's size sat up front. I'll preface this by saying that I know I fucked up. In retrospect, I was being careless and had become overly confident, but at the time I hadn't realized my carelessness. Now that that's been said, as soon as the car stopped, the smaller guy in the front seat got out and walked over to my half-opened window and said the words that started it all, words I will never forget.
"Run your pockets and I won't pepper spray you,"
he demanded, holding a can a few inches from my face and pointing it at my eyes. I looked at Joey, and my eyes said what he already knew. I tried to open the door, only to discover that there was a little more premeditation done on these guys' behalf than I had thought. When I learned the child safety lock on the backseat door was on, I was locked in. I made a sudden move, reaching my arm out the window trying to open my door via the outside handle. I got it open maybe 6 inches, and managed to jam my foot in it so the door couldn't be shut fully. Immediately he began spraying my face and eyes with the pepper spray, as the guy to my left grabbed me trying to prevent me from getting out of the car before they could finish robbing me. At this moment I was in fight mode, as flight mode was not an option. And whilst it may be stupid, I figured if I was going to be robbed, they would at least have to work for it. I'm not an easy victim. I turned to punch the guy sitting next to me in the face, as I figured he was the main threat. To my surprise and delight, the pepper spray did nothing. I could feel the cold of what just felt like water on my face, but I had no problem keeping my eyes open and focusing on the task at hand. I could see in his eyes he was shocked by my not being debilitated by the pepper spray, so when he finally began covering his face to attempt to block my striking it, I moved on to Joey, still sitting in the front seat. Joey I was the most angry at in all of this. I knew him, and he had set me up. As soon as I began swinging at him, the other small guy began punching my back and body from the front seat, and before I knew it, the bigger guy had me in a headlock from behind. All of this happening in a 4-door sedan, mind you. My door was still slightly ajar, as the coward with the pepper spray had jumped into the front seat so he could assist on their assault on me. My instinct was to cover my face, as I had been in fights before and I was now being struck by several people at once. A second later I felt someone reaching for my pant pocket, and I remembered the pills I had, and I knew I would rather protect them than protect my face and body. It was at this moment that I moved my hands that were covering my face to try to protect my jacket pocket in which the product was in. As soon as my hands were no longer covering my face, and I could see again, the first thing that caught my eye was the knife in the smaller guy's hand. My first thought was to draw my own knife to even the playing field, so to speak, but I've always known that when two people have pulled a knife, it pretty much forced one of them to use it in fear that if they don't, their opponent's knife will be used on them. For this reason, I did not draw my blade. I remember hearing someone shouting repeatedly to give them my stuff, although in all the commotion I couldn't tell who it was. Trying to save my pills, my body and face were left open, and they began to take full advantage of this. I remember blow after blow to my face and crown, as well as an array of shots to the rest of my body. The entire time I'm clutching my stash with something close to a death grip. So at this point the bigger guy has me in a headlock, and the other two are relentlessly trying to beat the will out of me to fight. At some point one of them punched me square on the top of my head, and boy did that punch connect. It genuinely rattled me, but in the moment, I noticed that the force of the punch on my head made the headlocker lose his grip, or at least slip a little. I took full advantage of this, and threw my weight to the right side of the car into my door, still just barely ajar. The next thing I knew I was sitting in the street with one leg semi in the car. I scuttled back and got to my feet before they could pounce on me whilst I was on the ground. I then drew my knife, and the smaller guy who was getting out of the car hopped right back in as Joey put the car in gear. Using my knife's button, I tried to smash the back right window, and then the rear windshield as they tried to speed off. They sideswiped 3 or 4 cars while pulling away, and I just stood there for a moment, processing what the fuck just happened. Reality snapped back in, and I knew I needed to get out of there. At this point, people were coming out of their houses and pointing at me. One woman shouted, "Your friends crashed into my car," angrily, to which I shrugged and began walking at a brisk pace. When I got maybe 5 houses down, a man standing in his doorway next to a toddler came running up next to me with a concerned expression. "You're bleeding a lot," he said nervously. I had been in fights before, and I know that when you get hit in the face, it generally bleeds a lot, so I wasn't worried, and I told him thanks, but I'm good, essentially. "No, you're really bleeding a lot. Should I call an ambulance?" he asked frantically, the entire time shouting to his toddler to stay in the doorway of the house. The man pointed to my left hip, where I noticed blood seeping through my shirt just above my belt. I lifted my jacket, and was alarmed by how blood-soaked my shirt was, and by the fact that the blood was seeping through said shirt. I then lifted my shirt, and followed the stream of blood with my fingers until I felt a large puncture wound between my armpit and ribs. Blood was gushing out, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. "Motherfucker," I thought to myself. I knew right then I had been stabbed. At the rate the blood was flowing out of me, I realized I would definitely need medical attention, and probably fast. I looked up at the man and asked him if he could go call an ambulance, as I didn't know the name of the street I was on. He had a look of pure horror on his face, just staring at the hole in my side. He quickly went inside and closed the door, shielding his kids from the view of what I now realized he thought would be my death. This part won't come to you as a surprise, but I don't have any formal medical training. Thus far, selling drugs hasn't necessitated as much. But I have seen enough old movies and TV to remember 2 basic rules. 1. Keep pressure on the wound. This one's pretty straightforward. And 2. In dramatic death scenes in movies, whenever a protagonist or their friend is dying, they always exclaim, "Stay with me, don't fall asleep on me," and stuff like that. So I did my best to keep pressure on the wound and stay awake. I remember drifting in and out of consciousness, waking up every few seconds to feel the stream of warm blood passing through my fingers before I would retighten my grip and pressure on the wound, before this process would repeat itself. I recollect feeling cold, laying on the sidewalk looking up at the sky, bleeding out alone. While I was well aware that this was a serious injury, there was never any fear of death. I felt content and fairly at peace, all things considered. A cop showed up first. He tried asking me some basic questions, but as you may have guessed, people in my now previous line of work don't like to talk to cops. I now understand that he was trying to get any information that would help solve my murder, because while I was ignorant of this fact at the time, I had a very slim chance of living. The EMTs showed up next. At this point, my feelings of being at peace and content were replaced by a sudden but very noticeable sensation in and around my eyes: the pepper spray. It was almost unbearable. With all of my adrenaline going, and in the commotion, I didn't feel any pain from it. But now laying on my back, pepper spray pooling around my eyes, it was the only thing I could feel. This was only amplified by the EMTs forcefully lifting open my eyelids to check my pupils, or whatever the reason is, as I desperately wanted to keep them shut due to the aforementioned pepper spray. Once more police showed up, people began coming out of their homes and formed a little crowd around me, watching the EMTs go to work. They cut off all of my clothes, so I was laying there naked in front of a crowd covered in blood. I remember hearing the EMTs saying, "He got hit there, oh, and there," and so on. I knew I had been hit many times, and thought nothing of this, until I saw one of them point to my puncture wound and say, "Looks like he got hit in the lung twice." I suddenly connected the dots. When they were saying hit, they were meaning stabbed. I couldn't remember how many times they said I was hit, but it dawned on me that I had been stabbed at least 5 through 10 times. I never freaked out. I just remember kind of thinking, "Aw, man, well, this is pretty not cool." And that's the last thing I remember. A few days later, I woke up in an ICU, my mom and best friend at my side. They went on to tell me that the doctor said that I had a very slim chance of living, and that the police had already been conducting a murder investigation for the last 3 or 4 days. My murder investigation. How's that for a trip? I had tubes and wires all over the place, and without a question, it was the most pain I had ever experienced. So it turns out I wasn't being punched, but stabbed rather. In total, I was stabbed 11 times, with 8 of them going all the way in, a 5 through 6 inch blade, by the way, and the other 3 getting caught in muscle or hitting bone before being able to further penetrate. I was stabbed in the left lung twice, ribs, stomach, one just to the right of my abs, on the right side, and my mid and lower back. I only spent 2 weeks in the hospital before they let me go home to recover there for a month or 2. It was really hard to wrap my head around what had happened, and how to deal with it. I know it's childish, and I now have a new way of thinking, but I was absolutely not going to talk to or help the cops with my now attempted murder investigation. Many of my friends and family ties would think very lowly of me, if not stop talking to me altogether, if they knew I was cooperating with police, even as a victim. We always police ourselves. Getting even was just a normal thing. But in the past, getting even meant beating someone up or something along those lines. These people almost killed me. The only way to get even close to even with them would be to stab them, or at least Joey, who I'm sure I could track down. I thought about it, and deep down I knew I had to let this go. I knew killing him wouldn't bring me any joy or closure. It would just ruin my life and his. Being such a small city, I was afraid of running into Joey, not because I was afraid of him, but rather because I would feel the need to retaliate. Since then, I've now calmed down and have a new, more adult perspective on it. Now lastly, just as a somewhat arbitrary detail, the day this happened also happens to be both my mom and my brother's birthday, so I was actually on my way to my mom's house after meeting up with Joey, or at least that was the plan. One of the most painful parts was having to see the look on my mom's face and the hurt I know she felt. On a brighter note, my best friend took off work and spent every day next to my bed in the hospital, hitting on nurses and keeping me company. I've made some mistakes, but I'm so thankful for the people in my life who care for me. Life is precious, and while I was leading a high-risk lifestyle, anyone can lose their life unexpectedly. So value your time on this earth and tell your loved ones you love them, because you never know when it's someone's time. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. So I don't think many of you needed it, but if you ever needed motivation to not sell drugs, I think you just found it. Tim. Thankfully you were able to get out of this situation and get yourself out of the business so you can live a little bit longer. It's unfortunate to think that that's a way of life for a lot of people, but it's a brutal reality. People live this life every single day, and they get stabbed every single day trying to make a living for their families. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that won't make it out of that line of work before it's too late, so thankfully you were one of them. I would like to thank everyone submitting their stories, as well as everyone sharing these videos. It really helps the channel out, and helps me get better stories for you all to enjoy. In case some of you might have missed it, earlier today I put up a video on Fear Your Maker. That video's got what some of you have been asking for, a Ouija board story, along with another paranormal, and I included some really funny bloopers in there. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.